If you're interested in decoding the complexities of China's national security outlook and its military modernization, check out Takshashila's latest expert capsule course offering China's defense in the new era. Visit school.takshashila.org.in and enroll in the course today.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. Today's discussion focuses on India's electricity sector. Around the world, electricity demand is rising sharply due to the post-COVID economic recovery, greater electrification of transport with electric vehicles coming into the picture, the growing share of renewables, and the expansion of data centers, probably also affected by the rising demands of AI, right? As a rapidly industrializing developing nation, how is India positioned to meet this surge in demand? And more specifically, what adjustments are needed to ensure that the power sector truly powers India's progress? And for this, we need to decode the complex world of India's energy transition. Today, we'll be diving into a controversy that's costing renewable energy developers millions and potentially could be slowing down India's ambitious clear energy targets. DSM penalties or Deviation Settlement Mechanism changes, which we are going to discuss in today's episode, were designed to maintain grid stability. But they've become a lightning rod of debate in the renewable sector. Are these penalties fair accountability measures, or are they unfairly punishing wind and solar developers or renewable energy developers for doing something fundamentally different from coal plants and other non-renewable energy sources? With billions of rupees at stake and India's renewable energy target hanging in the balance, this isn't just a technical debate. It's about the future of India's energy landscape. I'm your host for today, Arindam Goswami, and I work as a research analyst with the high-tech geopolitics program here at Takshashila. And today we are asking the important question, is the grid penalizing the very energy sources it needs most? And to discuss this very interesting topic, we have with us today Srinivasan Iyengar. Srinivasan is the CTO for the energy and resources industry in Asia at a major multinational technology company. He completed his PhD in computer science from University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research focused on distributed systems, cyber-physical systems, cloud and edge computing, and smart cities and energy. He is the perfect candidate to discuss this topic with us here today. So welcome Srinivasan. Great to have you here for this episode.
Hi, Arindam. Nice to be here once again.
So before we dive right into the question of deviation settlement mechanism, could you provide a brief overview of how we've come to this juncture? Why is this an important problem? And feel free to talk about the rising energy needs due to the growth of India, the growth in electricity demands, the new trends in demand and supply. How does all of this affect us? And then we can go into what's the current policy followed in India for this and go into the weeds with regards to DSM penalties. But let's start with a brief background of what our entire sector about. How is the sector affected by the renewable energy sources? What are the problems that's being caused by these new energy sources?
Right, Arindam. So happy to be on this call, and it's a great question. So even though I'm a computer science guy, I always feel like world moves because of economics. So even in this case, economics plays a very important role, right? For example, like you rightly pointed out, India is one of the fastest growing countries, and it is just transitioning from a $3,000 per capita country, which is driven mostly by major chunk of our population still is involved in agriculture, to in the next few years where we'll be hitting $10,000 per capita income. There will be a lot more industrial as a country, right? And many countries have gone through this journey. India is not going to be the first one. What world over people have noticed is that when they go from this $3,000 to $10,000, there is a tremendous growth in the energy demands. For example, this 300% increase in GDP or GDP per capita leads to almost a 150% increase in the energy demands per se. And when I say energy, I mean all kinds of energy. Of course, it is not a linear relationship because just because I am earning more money doesn't mean I will travel longer in my car to a new destination. Right? So there is, of course, a certain inelasticity to this demand. However, one thing to, if we drill it down to just electric demand, generally, if the country grows at a particular speed of, for example, India's nominal GDP growth is around 10%, real growth is around 7% or so. So generally, people have noticed that electricity demand goes slightly slower than the nominal GDP growth, right? And that is what is being observed in the past with many other countries. However, we just cannot compare what India is going to see by just looking backward, right? Because there are many confounding variables. For example, like you pointed out, our transportation, personal transportation itself is having a revolution of sorts. For 100 years, ICE vehicles ruled the roost, and now there is electric vehicles. So there is a major source of electricity that will be diverted to meet this demand. Even our public transport in India, many of the new buses that are coming in major cities are electric buses. Apart from that, as you rightly pointed out in your introduction, data centers are another source which is going to need a lot of electricity, right? So if I have to bet my money, I would in fact bet on the fact that our electricity growth would be in fact outpace the nominal growth, or at least in line with the nominal GDP growth, right? Now, of course, this is what is being anticipated. Then, as you would have noticed, in India, there is growth in terms of announcement of new renewable plants, and in fact, power plants of all types. But one thing that is unique about renewable plants is that it doesn't take a long time to commission a renewable plant, right? So once you bid in contract from the government, you can actually build the whole large power plant, like a gigawatt plant, in a matter of 2-3 years, right? This is unprecedented, right? So if you want to build the same one in terms of coal, it may take like 6-7 years if we are optimistic. And if it's a nuclear plant, it may take much longer because of all the compliances that are needed to get it commissioned, right? So fundamental to meet our energy demands, one thing is very clear, that we have to rely on more renewables because they can come online faster, right? Of course, not everything is hunky-dory with solar and wind power. For starters, they are intermittent, right? So solar plants can only produce power when there is sun. Farms can only power when there is wind, right? And of course, predicting weather is one of the difficult things in life. So of course, there is intermittency involved in that, right? So this is the backdrop of the entire setup. Now, of course, not everything is hunky-dory with solar and wind power plants. For starters, they are intermittent sources of energy, right? They are highly reliant on the weather. Solar depends on the amount of irradiance that is falling on solar panels. And of course, wind power depends on the wind that is present at that time. And because of the intermittency of solar and wind power, that may lead to grid instability issues, right? Again, sorry to go a bit technical, but in our electric grid, it's a magnificent mechanism, right? So at any given point in time, there are turbines that are producing power, and there are consumers that are consuming the power. And for most part of history that we know, there is no storage mechanism in the grid, right? So it's not like I produce power and immediately I store it in a big battery. If there is any storage available in the grid, at least till 1990s, there was hardly any, right? So the electricity that is produced at a turbine, it is almost instantaneously consumed by somebody, right? So because of this, balancing of supply and demand becomes increasingly complex with the increasing share of solar and wind. And because of that, of course, as the proportion of solar and wind grows in any particular country, you need to come up with mechanisms to make sure that the supply and demand matches. Otherwise, there could be several issues that can go wrong.
Right. So I think this is a good point to go into the details of the DSM penalties that we wanted to discuss in today's episode. But before that, what are these DSM penalties type of, right? They are a type of balancing mechanism probably, and why are they needed? If you could go into some of those details,
Sure.
that would help. As far as I know, DSM is a process through which developers compensate electricity grid infra providers for errors in forecasting and scheduling of power generated by their projects, right? So this was introduced to maintain grid stability as the renewable energy penetration increased, right? So can you go into some details as to how this mechanism exactly works? What are the percentages? What are the bands involved? What are the penalties? And what sort of revenue forego is involved because of this when it comes to the developers?
Right. So let's take one step back. So basically, DSM penalties India is, in a way, it's just what is called in globally as a balancing mechanism, right? So different countries employs different balancing mechanisms because, of course, all over the world, the penetration of renewables is growing and there are grid instability issues that are in the forefront. India is unique in terms of the fact that the mechanism in which we have implemented this penalty is rather unique, right? So what happens is that whenever there is excess demand compared to supply, the electricity frequency that you observe in the grid goes down, right? Which is not a desirable phase. Of course, something like a resistive heater, like a heater in your house, will not be affected by changes in frequency that much. But some of the other components in the electric grid, like transformers or some special kind of electrical devices, may get damaged, right? So all over the world, frequency in a very narrow band is considered sacrosanct, right? And of course, because of that frequency deviation, there are other impact of voltage fluctuations, which can cause more damage, right? So there are first order and second order impact, which have to be avoided. So if you look at the face value, India's balancing mechanism called Deviation Settlement Penalty Mechanism, right? It seems quite good, right? So there is a way in which both consumers and generators of power are penalized whenever it causes frequency deviation from the 50 hertz band that we have, right? Now, the formula, of course, I will not go into the details, but I just want to highlight that there is a band. For example, every generator and consumer of power, they participate in the markets. They say that I will consume 100 megawatt hours of power during this 15-minute interval tomorrow. And basically, similarly, there will be generators of power. They will say that I can generate X amount of megawatt hours of electricity during some different 15-minute interval, right? So there is, of course, the matching that happens a day in advance, right? Of course, for a thermal power plant, it's easier to promise a particular amount and then actually generate that amount of electricity, right? Because there is fewer variables involved in terms of what can go wrong in generating electricity from thermal power plants, right? However, same is not true for solar and wind, right? There is natural variability of weather, which impacts their performance. Now, I'm all for forcing our renewable players to make more accurate forecasts, right? That the intentions, I'm not doubting that one bit, right? We want them to, all the favorable behavior of the past where renewables were very small part of our energy mix, you have to incentivize them. So you give them very favorable power purchase agreement, right? And of course, now as their proportion grows, grid cannot be penalized overall for their intermittency. So I'm all for them making better forecasts. But some things are not in their control, right? So sometimes there is like excessively cloudy weather, which was not shown in the forecast previously a day in advance. Or there could be a stormy condition where even with very high wind, sometimes you have to stop generation in wind power plants, right? Even though the wind speed is very high, for safety reasons, you may want to stop the wind power plants from operation, right? So there are fundamentally few things that these renewable players cannot control. And suggesting that the government doesn't realize this. So in the past, the deviation settlement penalties associated with renewable plants were very different than what was the case with other kind of plants. So they had a differentiated setup. But the problem comes in the fact that the deviation settlement penalty that we have fundamentally doesn't capture the cost of adjusting the deviation. The reason for that is India, as you know, is like a one big market. So the frequency that you see in the grid, electric grid, is almost similar all over the country. So imagine that there is a grid instability or supply-demand mismatch which is happening in the southern part of the country, where the electricity demand is high, probably because of some heat wave, and there are not enough generators that are supplying that power. The good part about having one grid is that you can buy and sell power from different parts of the country, right? So if a hydro plant in Nepal, which India buys power from, if that can generate excess power, that can actually balance the overall grid. But this also, not everything has only a good part of the story, right? The bad part of the story is you don't want to handle the imbalance which is happening in the southern part of the country by providing power in the northern part of the country, right? So this doesn't capture the transmission losses that you will notice, for example, by transmitting electricity through such long distances. There can be much more intricate examples. I'm not just suggesting that electricity grid is very simple. There is just one electricity matched to one generator to one electricity. Imagine that there are hundreds of generators and thousands of consumers, right? So there are many parties to this huge network called our electric grid. But the example that I took was, of course, a simplified example. Now, there could be a lot more complicated story, right? So with renewable farms, Of course, you need to set out the transmission lines and other things, but renewable farms do not always produce power, right? So, for example, solar power will not produce any electricity for almost 12 hours in a day, right? And many parts of the day, even during the day, it may not produce the complete power, right? Because the sun is not exactly perpendicular to the panels, etc. Right? So many times what happens is that even though transmission lines are there to connect the two sources, which may be not very far, the transmission lines capacity may not be available. So that electricity has to be routed through some other transmission line, which is called a classic problem of congestion in the network, right? So many parts of the computer networks are applicable to electrical networks. And these are just two of the factors, right? Transmission losses over the long distances. This cost has to be borne by someone. And of course, there could be congestion issues, which also need to be handled. The current mechanism doesn't capture that, right? So that is a fundamental difference between what India has as a setup compared to all over the world, right? I mean, I don't know any other emerging market which has similar setup, but definitely the much more advanced world like China, Australia, UK, US, they do not have this kind of mechanism. So in that sense, India has a very unique way of settling it. The formula, as you said, is fairly straightforward. It gives visibility to all the renewable players on what penalty they might get if they don't meet it. However, it doesn't capture the underlying economics of the problem, which is a fundamental issue out here.
Right, right. So, if I understand it correctly, and from what I've read, all renewable projects are required to forecast and schedule their power output in 15-minute intervals on a day ahead basis.
Right.
And they may revise the schedule up to 16 times a day, is what I read, subject to one revision for each time slot of 1.5 hours.
Correct.
And there has been a timeline of key changes in this framework also. In 2015, I guess, the CERC, Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, they revised the DSM to include differentiated charges, and they allowed a deviation margin of 15%, I guess, without heavy penalties. Then they updated it to 10% or something of that sort. And then the latest ones were in 2024, I guess, where they have made it even more stricter, is what I understand.
Yeah, so next year, starting April 1st, 2026, it is expected to be around 5% deviation from what you have promised. So therein lies the problem, right, Arindam? So typically when you think about any good policy, right, so it should be process over people, right? So currently we are trusting people who are at the helm to make these small tweaks. So, and I understand where they're coming from, right? It's not that I'm not saying that they have any malice in changing this policy many times over the years, right? What has happened is a good thing that has happened is that the renewable mix is increasing in India. So I don't know if you read it, but 2-3 months ago in Rajasthan, many solar farms were actually told to curtail their power because almost all the electricity in the IEX market was met by renewable power, clean renewable power, which is what we all want, right? But we don't want that kind of story also, right? The renewable farms, even though they're generating, they will not be paid because grid cannot handle it. That is one part of the story. The second is that as the proportion of renewables grows, the grid cannot handle the excess variability coming from them, right? So let me take a very simplifying example. Imagine that there is an overall demand for 1,000 megawatt hours in India. Again, this is just an example. India's energy demand is very different, but just for the example's sake. And if you go many years ago, the proportion of solar and wind to this would be something like, say, just 5 megawatts, right? So a very small proportion, like 0.5% of India's electricity would be probably met by these renewable farms, right? Now, if you look at it, the proportion has increased to, say, if today I want 100 megawatt or 1,000 megawatts of power, maybe 300 of that is coming from solar and wind, right? So imagine that when it was just 5 megawatts hours, and you actually underestimated and you generated 10, right? So that's just a 0.5% increase from the overall energy mix that we had, right? Forget about 100% increase. Even if now you say you will produce 300, but if there is a 10% error and you end up producing 330, right? 30 in the mix of 1,000 is a very big number, right? So that is the root cause of all problems. The policymakers have been quite proactive in that sense. That's a good thing, right? They have been trying to make the penalty bands much narrower. But we have to think from all parties' perspective, right? So many of these renewable farm operators have set up their plants by taking a combination of equity and debt. and they have promised certain return on investment to their investors, right? Now, I'm not saying that we should care about the investors. They are investing in this knowing that there are risks involved out here. But constant tweaking of any policy actually is detrimental to the whole industry, right? So 2 years ago, people would have made these calculations and they have set up the plant. And now suddenly you are changing the bands, and tomorrow you may change some of the parameters that go into that formula itself, right? So that kind of uncertainty is not necessarily good for the growth of electricity sector in the country. And like we mentioned in the start, we want growth of all kinds of electricity sources, right? Not just renewables, but all kinds of sources, because India's energy demand is going to grow significantly. And such kind of constant tweaking, again, not attributed to malice, but they are being proactive and making those changes, but doesn't really give visibility to the people who will be investing in our green future, right? So if you look at it in the news stories, you will not notice that, okay, the renewable farms, they are not being installed at record levels in India. But what may happen in the future is that as the timelines for installing a plant is very less, right? Just 2-3 years. Any problem that happens now will only be seen 2 years from now. And at that time, you will not have enough time to, say, deploy a thermal power plant or some other power plant because their gestation cycle is even longer. So that is why it is necessary for the overall electricity sector, not just for renewable players. It is detrimental for thermal power plants as well in the long run.
Right, right. And if I were to, I was looking at some revenue numbers that this DSP mechanism is, costing the developers. It seems that from some reports that DSM charges typically cost developers anywhere between 0.3% to 0.5% of generation revenue, depending on their forecasting accuracy. Some penalties are in the range of 0.5 rupees to 1.5 per kilowatt hour for deviations.
Right.
And this is quite a bit of, penalties and revenue cost, right? So just wanted to understand, you did mention about how it works, how this balancing mechanism works in other countries, but maybe could you tell us about how this uncertainty is handled in contracts itself, or maybe through market mechanism in some foreign countries, and then maybe we can move into what could be the way out or the way forward.
Right. To start off with, I would say that whatever numbers they are quoting, right in the ballpark, just saying that these numbers will not just double because the band has halved from 10% to 5%. It may even quadruple, right? So more times you deviate in this band. So there'll be many cases where you are deviating by 7-8%, which was not caught earlier. And now those will be caught in this newer band, right? Not to mention the multiplying factors and other parameters that go into that equation may also change in the future, right? So there is both uncertainty and also the band reducing by half may in fact have a non-linear increase in the penalties that these operators pay. So, okay, let's leave that point aside. The question that you mentioned is quite valid, right? So why not look at other existing markets, in fact, which have a long history of integrating renewables? They may have some important lessons, right? So the good news is that, yes, of course, there are. The thing is, almost all over the world, again, every geography handles this in a different way. The balancing mechanisms are different in different geography. There are literally hundreds of different mechanisms going on. But you can broadly classify all those mechanisms into much more market-based approach that they have taken. Unlike in India, where the whole idea is to make sure that the frequency band is maintained. Like I mentioned, prima facie, it's not a bad policy at all. But all other countries typically follow a market-based approach, right? Let me take a specific example out here. In this podcast itself, I mentioned about congestion cost and transmission involved in transporting electricity from one part to the other, right? So what happens in US is that they have something called as locational marginal prices, where each substation in that country literally has a different price, right? So typically the price at any given substation has three components. One is the cost of producing that electricity. Second is the congestion cost, and third is the transmission cost, right? So what happens is that whatever balancing is required is reflected in the market price. And of course, it can stabilize on its own, right? Generators will be incentivized if there is higher prices, they will come online. And then as they come more online, the supply will turn to oversupply and then the prices will fall, right? So typical market-based mechanism, right? That is one way of handling it. That is much more a real-time way of handling it, right? So instantly, if there is any imbalance, the prices reflect that imbalance. And of course, it incentivizes different parties to take decisions. If the prices are high, the consumers may also reduce that demand, right? So it has a self-correcting mechanism, right? Now, I'm not saying that this is a perfect system, right? So in US, famously, there are not just, it's not a one country, one grid place. There are almost different operators in different geographies. So something like Texas, it has its own market called ERCOT. And there are other markets like that, like CAISO, PJM. All these are, you can think of it as continental US. Different organizations are handling it, right? Now, ERCOT actually, it has these pricing mechanisms. Apart from that, they have also something called as like ancillary services, right? So what happens is that typically in India, if you think about it, you will only get paid as a generator if you sell your energy, right? And of course, you will ask a question. Yes, that's right, right? Why should you get paid for doing anything else, right? So what happens is that all over the world, in fact, India also it is starting it. There are also something called as ancillary services. So something like a pumped hydro system or a gas-fired power plant, which can come online quickly to maintain grid stability. Those generators are just paid money to be flexible. So they are not just paid by producing the electricity; they are just paid to be flexible, right? Whenever there is a shortage in frequency, a generator can come up, and that can actually increase the frequency. And the opposite can also happen. If the demand is very low, you may ask some of the generators to shut down, right? So these are called ancillary services. And to be honest, India is also making big strides in this. There is a market-based mechanism which has recently been installed for these ancillary services also, right? But the problem here is that so one of the best forms of ancillary services is pumped hydro setup, right? And in India, the actual installed capacity for pumped hydro, and for the listeners, pumped hydro is nothing but a hydro power plant which can also consume power. So you consume power to pump water at a higher elevation, and you let go of that water from higher elevation to generate power, right? So think of it as a battery which can both consume and generate power. But here we are not moving electrons. Here we are moving water, and that's how we are storing energy, right? So there is a major push in the country towards having many more of these pumped hydro systems to actually mask the uncertainty that is there. But again, these things, of course, take time, right? Building these pumped hydro systems require a lot of permissions from different bodies, etc. There is geographical constraint also. You cannot build it everywhere in the country. But there is much good amount of progress happening, and the plans for India are very ambitious here. But we just need a lot more of these ancillary services available to maintain grid quality. Right. There is also a passive way of ensuring that nothing goes wrong. So, of course, ancillary services are good, but ERCOT, what happens is that many times in the real-time domain, the prices can shoot up like 50 times or 100 times the normal cost of electricity, right? Because whenever there is a shortage of this reserve power in the real-time markets, to balance it, the prices may go up significantly. And in fact, this was experienced during the 2022, I believe there was a storm, and that led to prices going really high, and that was not a good story for everyone, right? Now, fortunately, we don't have to repeat the same mistake. We should adopt ERCOT-style ancillary services and a mechanism to get that. Over and above that, there are other regions of US, which, like, for example, PJM. In fact, UK as a country, and even Australia for that matter, additionally also have what is called as capacity markets. So what happens in capacity markets, it's not a market where you pay one day in advance that just be flexible. So as I mentioned, there are two types of power plants. One, you get paid to generate power. Second, to be flexible. There are also third type of power plants where you can promise years in advance that, yes, I will be available, right? So those are called capacity markets, where just for the sake of being a participant in the market, you will get a small amount of money every year, right? Without even generating power. Right. So think of this as a kind of insurance that you take, right? So of course, nobody wants to die, but if some unforeseen things happen, insurance is very helpful, right? When something bad happens, you would think that, okay, good that I took insurance. Similarly, capacity markets are one way to reduce the volatility that comes with ancillary services and real-time adjustment. And it incentivizes people to be always available online. And when the situation comes, they can actually come online. And that time, the prices will not be so volatile. Right. These are the different ways in which we can actually fix the underlying issue. And I'm no way suggesting that we should copy these policies as is, right? In India, we have made tremendous strides in our electricity sector. It's about small tweaks. Now that we have introduced ancillary markets, it's probably about time that we also introduce capacity markets to actually incentivize these power producers more and come online. Right. And finally, again, going back to a market-based setup, in India, these renewable players cannot hedge, right? So, for example, they have to promise electricity a day in advance, so on and so forth. But if there is a shortfall, there's no hedging mechanism available, right? So, allow market-based hedging where there is a shortage, right? So, and again, I'm not suggesting something, it's not my idea, which is novel from my side. This has happened in many parts of the world, right? Like, for example, Australia is a very rich market in terms of it allows you to hedge against any uncertainties in generation, right? So it's about adopting all the best practices that are available from all over the world.
Out of these solutions, are some of them already there on Indian energy markets like IE external, or these something that will have to be developed, fresh in India?
Right. So parts of it are there, right? So apart from day ahead markets where you commit to consume or generate power day in advance, there is something called as real time markets, which the gate closure happens an hour or two before the actual commitment of electricity, right? So that's already existing. The volumes for the longest time were very low. But I think more recently, the volumes have increased in that. They have also introduced ancillary services. Again, these are early days. What could happen is we can actually merge these, right, ancillary services and real-time markets, which is happening in other parts of the world, just to provide a lot more. We need a lot more liquidity in the markets, right? So again, I'm not a markets expert, but any market which has very low liquidity is not an efficient market, right? So that can have its own drawbacks, right? And again, I suggested hedging as a policy, but if you allow hedging, there may be many other operators who are not interested in India's electricity future, but they are just in it to make some quick trading buck out of it, right? And again, I'm not passing a moral judgment out here, but just that all these things have to be thought out very clearly before going into implementing these things, right? And again, no way I'm underselling. I want to make sure that none of these things are easy to implement, but as we have seen in the past, the electricity sector has become a lot more open. There has been a lot of reform that has happened. We are at the right point in history where we go from $3,000 per capita to $10,000 per capita. And if we want to be the AI power of the world, we want to reduce dependence on energy coming from other parts of the world because of geopolitical reasons like crude oil, etc., then we have to rely on locally produced electricity. And that is why I feel like many of these hurdles may actually shackle us going forward. And if we want to maintain the growth rate, then the health of the electricity sector is super important.
And I was just wondering, how do energy storage solutions like improvements in battery systems, etc., factor into this discussion? Can
100%.
help renewable operators in managing this better, avoiding penalties, etc.?
Correct. So, in fact, again, I'm crystal balling out here. And in fact, going a bit past, I feel the change in the bands that you see in the DSM penalties, it comes from a good place, right? They actually want to force the renewable players to incorporate some form of storage to mask the intermittency locally itself, right? Again, that's a guess that I am throwing out here. I'm not saying this was the only primary reason for them to reduce it. The primary reason was, of course, to maintain grid stability. But having said that, even with storage, right, there is no question that we should have more storage, because any amount of storage equals more resilience of the grid, right? So imagine that there is a heat wave happening in one part of the country, and you know that middle of the day is when people will use a lot of air conditions in the offices, etc. For a short time, having this excess capacity which is available can go a long way, right? Not just for maintaining frequency or voltage fluctuations, even for as a mechanism to cope with any excess energy demand that comes up, right? And many times, as I mentioned, like today, the opposite is also happening. Like in the middle of the day, many solar farms are generating power, and in fact, we are asking them to curtail that power. Literally, that electricity is going waste, right? So that is where the storage systems can come into picture, and they can actually store electricity prices when they are low and release it when we do not have excess coming in, right? So in fact, again, that is where something like having deeper ancillary services market can actually help in building an economic case for building these storage systems, right? So storage can be of any type, right? It can be pumped hydro, it can be battery-based storage. This is an active area of research. People are actually coming up with new designs where they are actually storing this in the form of heat in sand, and that heat is then can be released to produce electricity, right? So there are many interesting ideas out there, and in fact, having a deeper ancillary services market can actually go a long way, and both ancillary services and real-time markets will go a long way in actually having more such plants getting online, right? And again, I don't want to be very negative out here. To be honest, there are lots of plants that are planned to be commissioned when it comes to pumped storage systems. And I think it's about time we actually think deeply about even battery storage systems wherever it makes sense.
Right. Fascinating information out here. To your knowledge, are any of these changes already being discussed by the government at the center or at the state level? Any such changes already in the pipeline, or if not, then are there any priorities by which we can order these changes?
So again, I'm not privy to the exact details, but if you look at the actions, right, that is very clear, right? So again, in face value, I don't want to say that it's a bad policy to have a narrower band. It's just governed by the fact that we have a certain policy in place. And for that to maintain grid stability, you have to tweak these bands, right? They are in that unfortunate situation. Similarly, as I mentioned, there is a lot of activity happening in pumped hydro space. I think it's a well-known problem now. There is, last 2-3 years, I think there is some action in the ancillary services. So it's not like nothing has happened, right? But this industry is not, it's not like instantly I can generate more power, right? So any project that has to come online, it requires a lead time, right? So in this sector in particular, I would like the government, and hopefully they're already doing that, right? I want them to look not just 2 years in advance, but 5 years in the future, right? So as you know, there has been a GST cut, and I was just looking at a newspaper that the AC sales have gone through the roof, right? Similarly, there is going to be pay commission coming in next year. There is income tax relief, which was offered last year. So there is a very high chance that the consumption in our country is going to balloon significantly in the coming few years, right? So just want them to be more proactive. And if you think about the other industrial policy that India has in terms of PLI, in manufacturing, etc., all these are reliant on the fact that any industry relies on electricity, right? If you don't have that, then you're compromising on your growth going forward, right? So we just need action quickly in terms of these different policies, adopt the best practices that are available in the world, and of course, Indianize it in our own context, right? Again, I'm not suggesting that we should go for full-on surgery out here, right? Just minor changes, introduction of new markets, making market deeper, having policies that learn from other mechanisms that are already present in the rest of the world can go a long way in actually fixing. There is no problem as such happening right now, but it's a major problem that can happen in the future. So it's always good to anticipate any problems that happen in the future and avoid it.
Right. Good final words to end this on, especially the part where we don't want to indulge in isomorphic mimicry, where we just copy ideas from some other setup and apply it here without Indianizing it, without customizing it. So yeah, thanks. That was a fascinating discussion. Any parting thoughts if you have for our listeners?
No, all good. I think I have a vested interest in this industry. In fact, one of my first papers in my PhD was about solar forecasting. At that time, it was a very academic debate because the proportion of renewables in the world was so low that no one cared about if they were overproducing or underproducing. After 12 years, I see that now it has become a very important problem to solve. And so want these things to ensure that the health of the electricity sector is good.
Thanks, Srinivasan. That was a very comprehensive discussion. I'm sure our listeners would enjoy this. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.